Tonight we have the 11th lecture of the series, The State of Israel and American Jewry in 4952. Can Zionism survive success? So as I say, let's get right in here, because tonight I'm going to be talking more about cultural history more than political history. Although with Jews, culture and politics mistig zusammen, as they say, is always a challenge. And yet, in many ways, the culture has its own kind of dynamic. So when we talk about Zionism as a phenomenon, as a movement, of course, we're talking about a movement with two heads, as we'll see in a minute. The first was political Zionism, founded by Herzl, and this is a phenomenon, movement that had a meteoric career. It's remarkable, just in history, that political Zionism gained its goal in 50 years. That's very quick in history. Back in 1897 is when it started, and by 47 the UN already made a Jewish state, as you know, the partition. So it's literally 50 years. This usually doesn't happen with nationalist movements. Herzl, when he started out, is a bluff. He didn't represent anybody, and the whole Zionist movement was a giant bluff, as I made before. They had no real elections among the Jewish people to name them the representatives, any more than the Associated Jewish Charities or any of these groups, or the American Jewish Congress or the World Zionist Organization, or anything. You know, the claims conference that we talked about last week, or all this, it's all a bluff. They call themselves the Jewish something, but it's not. And they justify themselves if they can pull something off. So Herzl, when he started, I'm sure many people say, who are you? But when he meets the Kaiser of Germany over here, like you see, and they take him seriously, and when he meets the British government and the Pope and the other Jews are like this, if he could do something, I own him. Right? Nothing succeeds like success. Moreover, the Zionist movement, the first Zionist Congress was 1897, in 20 years. That's very short. Got the Balfour Declaration. That's amazing. For a group that didn't really represent anybody, which was one big lie. The British government, as you know, having won the First World War just about, 1917, 20 years after the movement started, the most powerful country in the world, or certainly one of them, is the British Empire. That's a real thing. And they offered the Jewish people the land of Israel and the site of Israel, knowing full well the Arabs aren't going to like it. And it's just remarkable. And they offer it to who? To the Zionist organization. Who's that? And it's Chaim Weizmann, of course, but what's that? And they don't ask those questions. They don't say, who are you? Believe me, there were plenty of other Jews at that time, religious, not religious, this, that, and the other, who said, this is a bluff, they don't represent him, and don't listen to them, it's all a lie. Those Jews got no traction. Right? They got no traction. In England, they had what they called the Conjoint Committee. You had the Agudas Yisrael, you have this group and that group. Nobody listened to them. Instead, this group's claim to sort of mystically represent the Jewish masses was taken for real by real countries. This is extraordinary. 30 years later, they actually got a state of Israel. I mean, he pulled off the Balfour Declaration. It's like I say, it's one of the greatest bluffs that ever existed in history. And it's amazing. He did it with smoke and mirrors. He had no army. He had no money. He had no real group behind him. It didn't matter. It worked. During this half century, from 1897 to 1947, during this half century, there's no question that Zionism was the most dynamic political Jewish movement, period. And it captured the imagination of many. After all, think what I'm about to say. What other political Jewish movements were there? There were none, basically. Well, there are a few small crazy groups. But what group is there out there that was a political movement? Most Jewish groups define themselves as religious movements, perhaps, and maybe social welfare movements. I'll give you an example, the Associated, something like that. Social welfare movements. But they weren't there a movement to represent the political aspirations of the Jewish people. As you know, the very mention of the word political aspirations of the Jewish people drove many Jews up the wall. I'll just give you an example, the Reform Jews in America. So we're not the political, our loyalty is to Washington, D.C. And so Zionism was the only explicitly political movement. It went against the Jewish establishments, without question, and it captured the imagination of many precisely for that reason. From marginal status at first, it gained establishment status, and eventually even political correctness. So in the beginning, in 1897, 1900, 1910, and all that, Zionist movement was some little fringe nut group. They didn't represent anybody except themselves. I mean, how big was, for example, the Zionist movement in the United States? It was 3 Jews in Baltimore. To be perfect, Dr. Friedman. I mean, I'm serious. There were 3 Jews in Baltimore. Henry is old. But within 20 years, or 25 years, it gained establishment status and even political correctness status among the Jews on the basis of its political accomplishment. After all, in the Treaty of San Remo, it got international legal status, which wasn't bad for a band of bluffers. The Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government in the middle of the First World War, but the United Nations, or as they called it at that time, the League of Nations, which represented international law, international legality, all the nations of the world agreed in the Treaty of 1920 at San Remo to many things. One of the things was that England will get the mandate of Palestine for the purpose of implementing the Balfour Declaration, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. You can look it up online. So this is crazy. The Jewish people, there's even a question, what does that mean? Does that exist? We haven't been united as a nation ever since, you know, Bayez Sheni, and been scattered all over the world. Here's the Jewish people, and when they said the Jewish people, they specifically meant the Zionist movement. I mean, it says so in international law. It says the representative of the Jewish people is the Zionist movement, which will establish something called the Jewish Agency. This is what it says in international law, which, by the way, is still there today. In other words, the United Nations, just as a matter of international legal experts, the United Nations, when it was established in 1945, what it did was, it says, we're picking up from where the League of Nations left off, and all the legal moves that were made by the League of Nations are adopted now by the United Nations, except as they're modified as time goes on. So obviously, for example, the State of Israel was established in 1948 and all that. But the notion that there's such a group called the World Zionist Organization, which is called the Jewish Agency, is still a matter of international legality. And believe me, it has more nations backing that than the State of Israel does today. In addition, the events of 1914 to 1945, those terrible, worst 30 years in Jewish history. You would all agree with that, right? World War I, World War II, and the period in between wasn't that great? But certainly just World War I, World War II. Millions and millions of Jews were killed, as we all know. The events of those years seemed to bear out the visionary quality of Herzl and the correctness of his analysis, particularly his pillorying of Jewish homelessness and helplessness. This was his most famous shita. In other words, to put it in simple, I don't want to say vulgar terms, but simplistic terms, he saw Hitler before Hitler was coming. In the 1890s, he said, you better do something, because something bad's going to happen in Europe. I mean, you know, he didn't know exactly the way it would turn out, but it doesn't matter. He said the Jewish attempt to assimilate into Europe isn't working. The notion that we're going to get rid, as a result of emancipation, we're going to get rid of anti-Semitism, even virulent anti-Semitism, is not true. We Jews, he said, he wrote this in 1890s, we Jews are the cause of anti-Semitism. When we move to another country, we introduce anti-Semitism there. We carry it, he says, in our satchels. It's who we are. And therefore, the only civilized thing to do is get our own country. Right? So he said, in other words, so he writes it extensively. So he foresaw this, and if you're living in Europe in 1914, 1924, 1934, 1944, they say, oh, like we say today, why did Israel have to become a state in May 14, 1948? Why couldn't it be a state in May 14, 1938? And then we could say so many million Jews. So what I'm trying to say is the unfolding of international events seemed to bear out the visionary quality, and the Zionists could say, see, we told you so. Now, to be perfectly honest, on the other hand, you could say like this, you didn't stop the Holocaust, you didn't save nobody. You know, so it goes both ways if you want to get into that argument, but that's not how most people saw it. Most people said what I just told you before. Gee, if we had Israel in 38, after all, with all the discussion, all the thing, we could have saved all those millions of Jews. By the time World War II came around, and as the war progressed, everyone just about became Zionists, just about, even Reform Judaism. This was Julian Morgenstern. He was the head of Cincinnati, the Hebrew Union College. Reform, reform, reform with a capital R. You know, you got shot wearing a yarmulke. But he was put in there because he was extremely anti-Zionist back in 1924. Reform Judaism, in its original manifestation in the United States particularly, but also in Germany, was was very offended and very horrified by any notion of Zionism. They said this is dual loyalty. This calls into question our very Americanness. And second of all, it's a lie. We don't want to move to Palestine. We like it here in New York and Baltimore and Cincinnati very much. Thank you very much. America is a country unlike any other country that ever existed. This is a totally free country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in Germany, of course, once upon a time, they also said the same thing, that Germany is a unique country, it's uniquely civilized, and therefore the Jews feel uniquely at home over here, and so forth. They were very much opposed. And my point's like this: he has to quit by the time World War II is over. You understand? They get rid of him, because this is untenable anymore. You follow? And he can't change. And so, you know, he goes and retires to Rome, Georgia, you know, a famous Jewish center. And but this is brought out. I'm mentioning this, in other words, to show you how sweeping the Zionist mood was among increasing numbers of Jews as a result of the Second World War. There was a major battle in Reform Judaism in this country during World War II. You can read up on it if you want. The diehards, the reform of the old school, they formed something called the American Council for Judaism. Anybody remembers that? There were 94 rabbis, Reform rabbis, who signed a petition saying, basically, a Jewish state is Yehargval Yavar. Abba Hillel Silver called them the Goy 90s, you know. And here's some of the famous names of the past. Rabbi Lazaron was in Baltimore. I think the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, or Shalom, one of those two. Very popular rabbi. He originally was Zionist. Now, in World War II, he was very anti-Zionist. He was forced out. Rabbi Woolsey, nice Jewish name, was the president once upon a time of the whole reform operation. He was forced out. They made their own group. This guy was a Sonei Yisrael, believe me, you know, certainly a Sonei Medinat Yisrael. He was the best friend of Arafat later on, and to him, the worst sin in the world, and this is an ultra-reform rabbi, the worst sin in the world is Jewish nationalism and having a state, and he held this until he died a couple years ago. This is my favorite guy. I've told you the story before. He was the big reform rabbi in San Francisco, and very eloquent. He had a big pulpit, Emmanuel, the big reform temple there, going back from the 1800s. Super reform. And he preached in the 20s and 30s against Zionism, and that could get away with it. Came the Second World War and the Holocaust, all the rest of it. His own Balabatim, many of them at least, turned against him, not all. And especially the GIs that came back from the war and they saw the concentration camp, they say, you know, we really do need a Jewish state. And after the war, when his contract was up in 1947, I think, 47 or 48, he lost by 1 vote. It was a big thing. And it's a famous story. He lost by 1 vote because it was like 80 to 80, and then there was a lady who hadn't voted, and they called upon her to vote, and she voted against him. And they said, did you vote against the rabbi because now you've seen the cogency of the Zionist argument? And she says, actually, I don't pay much attention to Jewish politics. I'm just angry at the rabbi because back 6 years ago in 1942, he did not pay a shiva call at my house when my poodle died. Right? So from here, I want to warn all aspiring rabbis, watch out for the pooch. Right? Now, on the other hand, some of the at the same time, let's go to the next one. Some of the leading Zionists, like Abba Hillel Silver and C.Y. were Zionists, so they had their group. But what I'm trying to say is, these guys were weirdos back in the 1920s. They become the leader of the majority in the 1940s. That's the point I'm trying to make over here. And by the time the Second World War was over, you couldn't really have any standing in American Jewry, world Jewry, if you came out against Israel. You just couldn't do it. You had to, I mean, you'd be marginalized as this Rabbi Berger or something like this, all out in Mars. And even the Agudas Yisrael. They were very uncomfortable for religious reasons, for ideological reasons, very uncomfortable historically with the idea of a secular Jewish state, and they still are. The notion of a secular Jewish state, a state that's, you know, Eretz Yisrael, which is evolving almost on principle the denial of God, very bothersome to them. But in 1946 and 47, when it came to testify in front of the UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, Rabbi Levin, who was the head of the Aguda, he's the brother-in-law of the Ger Rebbe, Itamar Levin, he said like this, he says, we're not opposed to it either, even though we were before, but as a result of the war, we need it. And he signs the Declaration of Independence with Ben-Gurion. You understand? There were 2 or 3 members of the Aguda that signed the Declaration of Independence. Yitzhak Meir Levin, and one of them was Levenstein, that's Mosey Truoff's uncle or cousin or something like that, and there was a third one, I forget who. But the point is that just goes to show you, once again, the pressure that the Holocaust and its aftermath left on world Jewry among the widest circles, that, we need something over here, and you can't get better than the next one. You've all heard of Shragfai Mendelovich, and let's put it this way: he was an Orthodox Jew, I'm told, and wait a second, and he died in '48 because he was all upset because the Israeli army was being beaten in the siege of Yerushalayim. He wanted to go over. You look at the biography, you'll see he wanted to go and fight in the Tzahal and all the rest of it. And believe me, he wasn't a Tzioni at all. But the feeling that we got to get in Israel of one kind or another, and we'll leave the religious stuff to once we get the state, then we'll work that out. But now we need something over here. And even I would say for somebody like him, the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, the idea that the Bnei Yisrael deserve to be in Eretz Yisrael, imperfect as it is, we'll work on it to make it better. Even circles like him felt this way. So it's an extremely powerful dynamic. I give you all this simply to show you that political Zionism, up to 48, increased decade by decade in popularity and in cogency, I might say. As I told you last year, in the years 45 to 48 was the heroic hour of Abba Hill Silver, when he mobilized the Jewish masses all across North America, specifically in the United States, with his slogan, Al Tiftachu Medivim, no more Roosevelt, no more going behind closed doors and figuring the politicians will give it to the state. We got to organize what they disdainfully today call the Jewish lobby. And he created it. And what I mean by the Jewish lobby is like this: it's not a lobby unless you have branches everywhere. You understand? You have to have one in Baltimore, Maryland. You have to have one in Chicago. You also have to have one in Omaha and all these other places. And the Jews did it. And when you go at it like that, and your local congressman and your local this and that and the other knows that you mean business over here, you don't care about Truman anymore. And you remember, he was banging the table. He got thrown out of the White House, all the rest of it. But he said like this: enough of the Holocaust, and we're going to have a state now. And if not, let's blow up the State Department. That's who he was. And he did it. I'm going to say he, but notice he was a dynamic leader of a movement that for the first time mobilized American Jewry to the power that it could possibly have. And then, of course, let's face it, when Israel proclaimed its independence in '48, and the establishment of the State of Israel in the teeth of an Arab invasion, and it's a Rabin Bad Mahatim. I mean, it was a heroic struggle. You all know the Arabs invaded right and left. This, of course, captured the imagination of all of American Jewry, or just about, so that somebody like Golda Meir could come twice in '48, twice, and raise $50 million each time. It's $100 million. That's a lot of money. At least it was once upon a time. You understand? Without this, they couldn't have survived. And let's face it, who can fail to be moved? Who can fail to be moved by the fact, with the next one, that when they proclaimed the State of Israel, that's the end of homeless Jews, right? Whatever you want to say about the subject, but until this was the face of Jews in the early part of the 20th century, and particularly in the First World War, and of course in the 1920s and 30s. People forget, but the American Jews have not forgotten. Just get an old newspaper from the 20s and 30s, and you see homeless, barefoot Jews being thrown from country to country in Austria, across the Czechoslovakian border, and Poland. I'm talking about before Hitler came along. In Romania, and this and that and the other. And Kal v'chomer, once Hitler comes into power, and then the German Jews and the other Jews have to go, I'll just say the St. Louis ship, you all know what I'm talking about, that they can't go anywhere. And all those jokes, the gallows humor of the German Jews back in the 1930s, it says, you know, where he goes to the travel agency, he says, give me a ticket where? I don't care where, anywhere that'll take me. You know, the homelessness and the helplessness of the Jews was so powerful, and whatever you want to say is no more homeless Jew. Right? You know, whatever you want to feel. If you want to go somewhere, you won't be a stateless refugee. It's a big deal. And so all this was extremely powerful, but I've only taken you up to 48. Once the state is established, and once it's successfully defended, now what? Right? What do you do with political Zionism now? They got a state. From a purely Herzl point of view, from a logical Herzl point of view, the Zionist movement should hold a party, celebrate its success, and dissolve. You got the state. Zionism has lost its raison d'etre, its very purpose. It was a great, notice, like all great reform movements, political reform movements. I'll give you an example. Did you have a movement in this country to give the women the vote? You did. Once they got the vote, fine, it's over. Now we move to something else. Did they have a movement over here, you know, to give civil rights? They have civil rights. No, it's over, you know. So here also you got Israel. So the World Zionist Organization should dissolve, should go out of business and celebrate. Interesting idea. This is what many American Jews wanted to happen. Because as I said before, if you take this as a political movement with an objective, they got the objective, and that's it. The most important people who wanted this to happen were what we would call the American Jewish Committee types. The rich and powerful Reformed Jews and other Jews in all the different areas. They never felt comfortable with the political aspect of Zionism, but at least you can understand that in the 30s and 40s, for crying out loud, it's possible to have a movement to help the poor refugees get a homeland in Palestine, and that's a charitable cause, it's a reform cause, and it doesn't take away from your Americanness or your Britishness, whatever, if you're in favor of that. But now, once you got a state, it's a different story. If you're going to be loyal to that state, move there. Otherwise, you're a traitor. It's a dual loyalty. See, this didn't exist before 1948. There's no such thing as a Jewish state. So somebody who said, like Abba Hill Silver, the others, I'm a political Zionist, that's like being in favor of solving one of the many problems of the world. The Jewish problem was one, not the only one of the many problems out there. Correct? So the person in favor of political Zionism says, I have a particular solution for this problem. But now, it's not there. Brandeis was famous back in his time. You know, he died in 1940, 41. But when he was a big judge, he was famous for always saying, listen, it's totally fine to be a political Zionist. I am. I'm still an American. I'm a justice on the Supreme Court. This is, like I just told you before, it's one of the progressive causes out there because, after all, you got all these homeless Jews and helpless Jews and anti-Semitism, and it should be for it. But once Israel's established, then guys like him, Jacob Blonstein from Baltimore, they say like this, you have a state. If I want to move to Israel, I'll be an Israeli. But if I don't, I'm an American. So there shouldn't be any more political Zionism over there. And hold that thought as we'll contemplate the other side of Zionism, the other story. Let's go back to the 1800s again. The other half of Zionism was not so simple. This is what we call cultural Zionism, mainly associated with Achana Am. Here, these people, this is the third wave of the Haskalah in Russia. These people, believe it or not, were not interested so much in a Jewish state. If you read the writings of Achana Am, he was a big skeptic and rationalist, and he said like this, there'll never be a real political state in Israel, and anyway, what's the point? They can only fit a couple 100,000 people there maximum, and all the people who dream about a political state like Herzl are nuts, and they're deceivers of the public as a Pied Piper. They're actually criminal activity for giving the Jewish masses hope that it'll never be there. I'm telling you, he said you can't have more than 250, 350,000 Jews altogether in Eretz Yisrael, but it should be the right kind of Jews. Okay? And the right kind of Jews means people who will be able, listen closely, I'm going to say, people who will be able to redefine Judaism away from being a religion. Because religion is of the past. The Christians in Europe are getting rid of their religion as far as national culture is concerned. The educated Englishmen, the educated Frenchmen, Russians, Germans, and all the rest of it, the educated ones, are getting past all that, and they're getting ready for the brave new world. Right? World of science and technology and so on and so forth. And culture. Culture means books and plays and art and all this other kind of stuff. And that's what Judaism is. Okay? So in other words, these are principled atheists. Let me be very clear about this. Okay? And so he certainly was. And the idea is that Judaism is an atheist phenomenon. Now, somebody will say like this: how can you deny the fact that Jews have been a religion for so long? Of course he knows that. And he said this was something that Judaism, in its national genius, developed long, long ago in order to be able to survive the Middle Ages in its religious phase. But just like Christianity, they went through that phase, and now they're taking those clothes off and putting on a new suit for modernity, so Judaism should do the same thing. What I'm trying to say is over here, this is already a different nature. It's not political what I'm talking about. This is cultural. Of course it's political in the sense that it's talking about political, cultural politics. But we all know Jewish cultural politics is daggers, right? And so he advocated, and he got a lot of followers. He advocated the idea of the redefinition of Judaism along secular lines. Again, very bluntly, I mean, along atheist lines. That's what it is. We respect the Jewish culture of the past. He himself was born in a Hasidic family. He was a relative of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and a Chukka Rebbe, but that's from the past. And now he wants to move on to the future. This kind of Zionism was actually more popular among wider circles of Jews in the West, particularly in the United States, than political Zionism was. Because since there's nothing political in what I just said, not politics, not high politics, this simply has to do with what you teach in Hebrew schools and synagogues, all the rest of it. This guy, Mordecai Kaplan, who was, you might say, his main follower, was the one who introduced these ideas, without saying it specifically, into American Jewish life, already starting literally 100 years ago. Actually, you'll laugh at what I'm going to tell you. 100 years ago, in 1912, Mordecai Kaplan, who was, let's put it this way, what I would call an atheist, he founded the Young Israel. They just didn't go exactly, unfortunately, they went off the derech for him, you know. But yeah, I promise you. So and he was a very visionary type of guy. He had a lot of interesting ideas, all the rest of it, and he was very organized in his approach to organization of Jewish life and education, all the rest of it. But the content was totally cultural Zionist. And what I'm trying to say is, most people aren't aware of what I'm about to say. He founded the first teachers' college, and he educated, brainwashed, whatever you want to call it, the first and the second and the third cadres of the type of people who taught in most Jewish schools in North America for the next century. Now, I'm not talking about TA, but I'm talking about, no, I'm serious. I'm talking about the synagogue schools, I'm talking about the Talmud Torahs, I'm talking about the kind of Jewish education which is for the masses. Most kids in America do not go to TA, TI, Beis Yaakov, or Bet Tefillah for that matter, or anything like that at all, as you know. The vast majority of the Jewish kids in America, and even today it's worse, even a generation or two or three ago, went to these limited sorts of things in which, what were they taught? It's not a question that they only had 1 hour a week to learn about Shabbos. You don't learn about Shabbos. At least you don't learn about Shabbos in the religious sense that most people would think about it. You learn it in a totally different way, and the more you get along and higher in the grades, the more clear and blatant, shall I say, the atheism comes out. But let's put it this way. This was in sync with the ideas of the 20th century. The idea of secular Zionism here was that it will become the very content of Judaism, displacing fundamental religion itself. Ahad Ha'am was the big opponent of the Mizrahi movement. The Mizrahi movement, here tonight is sponsored by the religious Zionists. The Mizrahi movement was founded in 1902 specifically to combat Ahad Ha'amism, the totalizing cultural Zionism. It doesn't look like there's a bunch of Reform rabbis over here. This Rabbi Reinitz, by the way, who is the founder of the Mizrahi movement, they were Zionists who were militantly opposed to cultural Zionism. You get it? They said we are Herzl Zionists. That they don't look like it, but they were. You get it? Notice they said, yes, we're religious Jews in Russia, as you can tell. We want to have a state of Israel. We'll go over there and try to make it religious. What they were opposed to was what I just described before, was a redefining of Judaism along strictly secular lines, which is a battle they lost, as we all know. Because the culture that developed 100 years ago, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and afterwards in Israel, the majority culture was a secular culture. It was a cultural Zionism. In other words, the culture, the majority culture of the state of Israel today is the heirs of cultural Zionism. It's Hebrew speaking, it's Jewish of course, but it's distinctly secular. they've had their developments like everybody else does, but that's they feel comfortable with. And the education system in Israel, the public school system reflects this, the universities, of course, reflect this, and so on and so forth. That's why they're having trouble with the rise of all these religious Jews and then, the Haredim and all the rest of it, because they're coming from a very different kind of point of view. As I said before, this kind of Zionism was much more widely accepted and disseminated in America precisely because it didn't involve anybody getting involved in politics. If you ask the average American Jew in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it's just, are you in favor of the Zionists or the Palestinians? Should the Jews go and challenge the British Empire? What do you think about the Irgun and the Haganah? They say, most Jews, unless you are Fabrenta, they say, I don't feel comfortable with politics. I'm glad we have a country like America, no Holocaust here, and everything like that. But if you said, are you in favor of Hava Nagila? Are you in favor of the Torah? Are you in favor of Ivrit? Are you in favor of having, education which emphasizes the kibbutz in Palestine and the songs, all the rest? That's very good. You understand? And anyway, that's what the teachers were teaching over here. And I would say it swept American Jewish culture. It swept American Jewish culture. Believe me, it's going to sound funny what I'm saying, but the TA, just thinking off the top of my head, was a revolutionary school in American Judaism once upon a time. It sounds funny to say this. It was going completely against all the others, even though the TA, had Hatikva and all the rest of it. But the fundamentalism that it taught was totally at variance with 99% of American Jewish education as pervaded across the country. The cultural Zionism did indeed come to define Judaism itself in the years 1900 and 1950. It was the very stuff, as I said, of the Talmud Torahs, the synagogue schools, the teachers' colleges, and the rabbinical seminaries. Not the religious ones, not the Orthodox ones, but it's the very definition of Judaism as taught in the Jewish Theological Seminary, of the conservative, and eventually even of the Reform. Mordechai Kaplan did it here, and the guy named Gamaran did it, but the Reform, it happened. A key element of this education and culture was a downplaying of fundamentalism. There's the belief in God, the belief in Torah, and all that. An upplaying of Ivrit, and the new secular culture growing in Israel, as I said before, knowledge of the culture of the Yishuv, songs and dances, glorification of kibbutz, Jewish pride through nationalistic identification, and vicarious excitement. This was the very successful package of education that was put together by Mordechai Kaplan and picked up by his students and admirers really all across the country. I can't overemphasize how strong an influence he had in American Jewish culture. This now we come to 1948. This cultural Zionism was not made irrelevant by the founding of the State of Israel, which was, after all, a secular Jewish state. On the contrary, now you would think the full, what they call the Merkaz Ruchani, Israel, become a spiritual, cultural center, can be realized. You have a government, you have a nation, with all the apparatus and tools of nationhood, school systems, universities. They even have what they call in Israel a Ministry of Culture. It's all in Hebrew. Now you can really realize the dream, you might say, of Achad Ha'am and his guys. And let me say very briefly what it was. Achad Ha'am lived 100 years ago and before that in Russia, and he recognized at that time that the Haskalah, which was the secular Jewish culture at that particular time, was not working. By that I mean, it was not preventing among the youth in Russia mass defection from Judaism and Jewish life, mass assimilation and intermarriage. And if you have that, you lose. And so the trick was to keep everybody secularly Jewish, generation after generation. But how does one do that? And when he saw that the creation of a Haskalah, of a secular Jewish culture in Eastern Europe wasn't working, his own kids ended up marrying out the most famous Hebrew poet of the Haskalah, very great poet, terrible guy, but very great poet, called Yehuda Leib Ginsburg, writes a book, a famous poem towards the end of his life, Lemi Ani Amel. Who am I working for? I spent all my life with developing Hebrew, and my own kids, the grandchildren, the others aren't interested in it. The irrelevance is the great threat. And so they came up with the idea that as long as the Jews are in the Golah, as long as Jews are in a place like Russia, Germany, Poland, and all that, in a majority Gentile culture, it won't work. But if we establish our own bubble in Palestine, where it'll be places like Tel Aviv or Yerushalayim or wherever, and it'll be a bubble. In other words, you'll have klein aber shine, as they call it, small but pretty. You have the right kind of olim, and they'll be very culturally aware and active, and they'll create a model society, and there'll be farmers, and also artists, and there'll be Athens. It'll be Rome. It'll be a place that produces a great culture, and this will sort of permeate out from Israel, Kimitzion Teitei Sarah, in a secular sense. It'll permeate out of Israel, and Jews, secular Jews, in Russia and Italy and America and all the rest of the world will be so inspired by that they'll say, we want to continue to retain our Jewish identification because we want to be connected with this glorious and very positive kind of culture. The modern equivalent of that, I mean, to vulgarize it, would say, a Jew today say, oh, I like Israel, it's a startup economy. It's what's attractive. Israel started the drip culture and the little tomatoes and all that business, right? So, now this is crazy. This is not going to work. And it doesn't work today. Meaning, what I just described, no matter how many great things Israel does, it's not keeping the allegiance, it's not going to prevent a boy from marrying out in college, right? Because there's a Hebrew play being written in Jerusalem. Furthermore, to be perfectly honest, Israel never really did develop into what we would call a model civilization. I mean, here's the face of Israel, right? To be perfectly honest, right? I mean, I got nothing against them, but you can't, this is not Athens. You understand? This is not Rome in its glory days. You see? Israel's a country. And they had to, and they fought to make a living and to put bread on the table and to make their mistakes like every other country makes mistakes. It's not a work of art. It's not so gewaldic. And so the result is that, is this really going to convince American Jewish youth, British and Canadian and French Jewish youth to want to stay Jewish if they're secular? Because, oh, look how great gewaldic Israel is. So Ben Gurion will say like this, well, maybe it'll come one day. We're going to be an Or LaGoyim. That's his favorite phrase, a light to the nations. It's hard to think of Israel today as a light to the nations. But at that time, in 48, 50, 51, 52, in those early years, this was the big selling point. But not really. Not really. 60 years have passed by. Israel not an Or LaGoyim. Israel will never produce the kind of model civilization that Haram dreamed about. All you get is Hava Nagila, to be perfectly honest. Hold that thought. What about the apparatus, the large apparatus of the World Zionist Organization? Logically, after 48, there's an Israeli government. The WZO, the World Zionist Organization, should dissolve its Palestine offices and funds. Why should there be, I mean, it's almost ridiculous. Why should there be a Tel Aviv office of the World Zionist Organization? There's a country called Israel. They should handle all that kind of stuff. But no. First of all, let's be honest. Tammany Hall. It's too many jobs and job holders. Right? A ton of people became Zionists because they make a parnos at it. I don't blame them, but it is what it is. The face of this was Levi Eshkol, who was the head of the Jewish agency, and here's this famous slogan, Lo Saksam Sharbadisho, which means don't stop an animal from eating when it's working over there, meaning you're going to have a certain amount of graft. That's the way it goes. This is, I think, one of his most famous statements. Now, therefore, you have thousands of jobs that we're talking about over here. It's not going to go away. As a result, parallel and redundant bureaucracies will become a key feature of a bloated Zionist machine. And that's true today. In addition, the World Zionist Organization, or they call it the Sachnut, the Jewish agency, is going to be retained for tactical reasons because it enables discrimination against the Arabs. After all, the JNF, the Keren Yesod, are only for the benefit of Jews. And that's actually indefensible in world opinion. If you're going to have everything logical, then you're going to dissolve all the Zionist organizations, hand those jobs over to the Israeli government. What's the Israeli government going to say? We're going to take all the land and only give it to the Jews and discriminate against the Arabs? Israel's a free country, a democratic country. According to the Israeli Declaration of Independence and all the laws, it's got to be even Steven. You can't have discrimination against one sector over the other. Right? But Israel wants to do that. After all, whatever it says, it was set up for the Jews. And so how do you have that Excuse me, how do you have that? You simply do it like this. The Israeli government is free for everybody. Then there's something called the Zionist organization. The Zionist organization had the JNF, and they own the land. Right? They own the land, they only give for Jews. It's a separate organization. It's got nothing to do with Ben Gurion, I think, right? This is the JNF. The Keren Yesod is there to build houses for Jews. The Israeli government, if they're going to give a budget, and once in a while the Israeli government gives a budget, that they give even for the Jews and for the Arabs, If they're going to say $1 million for water, they're going to have to spread around evenly. But the Zionist organization, the Jewish agency, they have what they call a development budget, a taksi for development, and they do it just for the Jews. If Israel will say that we want to give extra money for having a baby, oh my God, the Arabs will have 20 babies, and it's counterintuitive, and the Israelis have none, and you're supporting your enemies. But if the World Zionist Organization says as a result of the Holocaust, they're going to have a special fund to help families that have more children, that's a Zionist thing. It's not an Israeli government thing. No, it's a lie. But, the whole thing develops along there, and that's one of the main reasons why they retained, and they retain till this day. These redundant and parallel organizations, turns out they're not exactly so redundant, and they're not exactly parallel, but it's very cynical. Right? The whole thing's very cynical. So when, after all said and done, what is the job or the task of a Zionist after 1948? And what do? You're not fighting to get a state, you got a state. You're not fighting to create a culture, go over there and participate in the culture if you wish. Frankly, cynically, it's money. Right? It's money. The old saw that went back already 100 years ago, a Zionist is a Jew who pays another Jew to send a third Jew to Palestine. That was a joke they made up in 1900 or something like that. But it was true. Right? It's truth to it. So, give money to Israel. Well, you don't have to be a Zionist to contribute money to Israel. True? You write him a check. So what's a Zionist? I mean, is it office holder? A president of a group? A treasurer? I mean, is that what it is? Is it bureaucracy? Just so you can walk around and have a title? Ben Gurion, realizing this, said in 1949, the definition of a Zionist is one who makes aliyah. Anyone else is no Zionist. Every single Jew in the world has a moral obligation to move to Israel, otherwise they're jerks. This is new. Herzl never said that. Hanam never said that. I told you, he calculated only a tiny group was going to be in Israel anyway. And even Herzl was a great political liberal. He was. He was what we would call today a liberal. And he said like this. He said, I'm not telling every Jew to move to Israel. Those Jews that will need to, who will live in anti-Semitic countries or will be moved for their own reasons, just like America. You want to move there, you can move there. As a matter of fact, the glory of Israel will be it's all voluntary. There will be many Jews, Herzl said, maybe even himself, that will stay in Vienna and stay in London and places like that. That's okay. Just the Jews will have the option. So there'll be nobody homeless or helpless, that they'll have a country to move to the same way it is with everybody else. Not all Frenchmen live in France. Not all Englishmen live in England, and so forth. There are huge German minorities, or there used to be, all over Europe. Correct? Tons of German minorities elsewhere. Irish. Oh, let's use that. How many Irish are there in America? More than Ireland, It's okay, but Irish want a country. So that if they want to, they can go there. Same thing over here. What Ben Gurion said radically new. As a matter of fact, maybe a religious Jew might say this. From a halachic point of view, you can debate that. Whether Yishuv Eretz Yisrael applies at all times to everybody back and forth. Ben Gurion not coming from a religious point of view. The entire Ahad Ha'am platform, actually, I told you before, was an exclusivist one. I mean, the World Zionist movement, which Ben Gurion was actually leading, prior to the Holocaust, it didn't want all the Jews to come to Palestine. You hear what I'm saying? They didn't want that. They wanted the right kind of Jews, what I call the Gucci Aliyah. I said it 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, whenever, if not, you have to remember, one of the great tragedies, as far as I'm concerned, in modern Jewish history, in the 1920s, 20s and early 30s. Because especially in the 20s, the Arabs weren't organized to oppose the Jewish immigration, and the British were getting along at that particular time. I'm talking about 1921 to 1929. We're getting along with the Jews, and the first High Commissioner in Palestine was Herbert Samuel, who was a big Zionist himself. And they basically said to the Zionist organization, you organize the Aliyah and figure out, you want 20,000 to come, 20,000. You want 50,000 to come, 50,000, all that. At that time, if they would say, bring in a mass movement, we would have had a Jewish majority, and we have Israel in 1928, or somewhere along those lines. And then we wouldn't have had a Holocaust taka, you see? And this was the shita, as you know, of Jabotinsky, who said, now there's a window of opportunity. He said, bring in 2 million, 3 million people, even if they sleep on the beaches of Tel Aviv. But we'll make a Jewish state, and then we'll worry about the rest afterwards. But no, this was not the policy of the powers that be, of Weizmann and Ben-Gurion and all the others. They said, no, we want the right kind of Jews to come in. We don't want the ultra-Orthodox, for example, to come in. We don't want old people to come in. We want people who went to Achshara, who are young, who are already indoctrinated in Zionism, so they'll come here. Now, I understand where they're coming from, but what I'm trying to say is, now, in the middle of nothing, Ben-Gurion comes and says, a Zionist is somebody who makes Aliyah. They themselves didn't let the people make Aliyah beforehand, but of course, now that they have a state of Israel, everything's all different. And if you want to look in history, the last time all the Jews lived in Israel was Bayis Rishon. In Bayis Sheni period, think about this. There were substantial Jewish communities in Chutz La'aretz. I'll give you an example. Bavel, you've all heard of that. Alexandria, you know, there was all this huge Jewish community. And Rome itself had a very large Jewish community. I just wrote about it not long ago. And elsewhere throughout the Roman Empire and the medieval world. I mean, the ancient world. This was true long ago. This was debated, to be perfectly honest, in the Gemara. Reb Chia versus Rish Lakish, I think. If I remember correctly, Reb Chia always said like this, and he was from Bavel. So he said, oh, it's a good thing, you know, that the Jews are scattered in different countries. So if the Romans, like Esav said, Im Yavo Esav al Machane Ha'achas V'Ko, V'Yah Machane Nisha Lefleta. You know what I mean? He says, if the Romans crush, as they eventually did, the Jewish community in Palestine, well, there'll be a Jewish community in Babylonia to pick up the flag. You see? And on the other hand, Rish Lakish, you've heard of him, the famous Amora, he damned every Babylonian Jew he met. And he said, guys like you have caused the destruction of the Jewish state. If you would all make Aliyah, like Ben-Gurion, if you would come now, he said, then we never would have had a Churban and all that sort of thing. So, you know, these issues have been debated by serious people thousands of years ago. The Zionist movement had never advocated that all the Jews have to move to Palestine. If they would have done that, they would have lost all their support in the 1920s and 30s. I'll tell you right now, it was the opposite. It's like we said before. The poor Jews, the German Jews kicked out by Hitler, the Polish Jews kicked out by Poland, they need places to go to. I'm not telling everybody else to go move over there. The idea that Aliyah is the supreme mitzvah in Judaism, at the same time that you denigrate all the other Shmiras and mitzvahs, was actually highly offensive, for example, to Orthodox Jews. You know, if you're really worried about the mitzvah of Aliyah, what about the mitzvah of Shabbos, to take one example? Ben-Gurion knows all this, but he's searching in the late 40s, early 50s for a role for Israel. He does not like the role of poor relative, which is what Israel is. He does not want to be condescended to. On the contrary, he wants to be the one who condescends to the others. How do you do that if your country is broke and making all the different mistakes? In addition, Ben-Gurion had a certain contempt for quote-unquote Zionism, for whom Zionism is an avocation, which is what it was after all to most American Jews who are Zionists. Ben-Gurion comes from a totalizing party culture, which is foreign to the American reality. Let me explain. In Europe, I think I've mentioned this before, in Europe, they have a different political tradition than we have in America. Everybody, I'm sure, voted in the last election, most of you. And there are people that don't vote. And you don't get shot in this country for not voting. But a person who votes at all the elections, especially the local elections and this election, that, is already a good citizen. Are you a Hasidic Democrat or Republican? If you make a living at it, right? There's a few people that are very enthusiastic about politics, but usually they're making some kind of a living at it. There's not a tradition in this country of mass party organizations. You can vote for Obama. He put together a big group, first time, second time, but when the election's over, it dissolves, and the college kids go back to college, and the other people go back to college, except the ones who get a job with the government. And same thing with the Republicans. And so, what I'm trying to say is, in the American culture, political culture, a party is not a totalizing instrument. It doesn't define who you are. It just covers one aspect of your life. It's a very important aspect. Don't take it away. I believe everybody should vote all the time, twice. But well, that's the minhag in Maryland, you know. But the fact is that in Europe, already in the late 1800s, they developed a different model. First, the socialists did it in Germany, and then it spread elsewhere. And that was the totalizing party model, which means that the socialist movement realized long ago that all the workers are poor, but if they organize the workers, not only in election time, but all year long, and everybody gives a nickel, pretty soon you have a little bit of money to play with, and for that money you can start a sick fund, a kupat cholim. You can start, as they did in Germany, a burial society. So when people die, they actually give them a decent burial, don't throw them in a pit like Mozart or something. You can even create a summer camp for the kids out in the country, so that won't just be the rich kids. If you are sufficiently cultured, you might collect enough nickels together that once in a while you can rent the symphony that should play for the workers. And you know the old line: Atlanta born, Atlanta bred, and when you die, Atlanta dead. You know, you live your whole life in the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and when the Catholics copy this model, you spend your whole life in the Catholic Socialist Party in France and in other countries like that. And so the people with whom you interact, you go to the same school they went to, the same summer camp they went to, the same concert they went to, the same outing on Sunday they went to, and next thing you know, the girl or boy you marry is from that group, and you're assured of their vote at election time, and you're sure they're going to work in between the elections very hard also to keep up the culture. The Zionists picked this model up around 1900, 1910, and they created a totalizing Zionist culture long ago in Eastern Europe and places like that, and transferred over into Palestine. So just to make something up, you know, if you're a labor Zionist, or if you're a Jabotinsky, you know, the revisionist, you go to this school that's run by the Tenuah, and you certainly go to when school's over, you go to the youth group that's run by this Tenuah. If it's a religious Zionist of a certain type, it's called Bnei Akiva. If it's another group, it's called Yavne. If another group is called the Dror and Bar Kochba, all the different names. And like I say before, on Lag BaOmer they have this particular groups on the trips, and in the summer they have their activities. And when you go to college, they go to the college group of this, and you marry somebody from the group, and so on and so on. You live your whole life within that Dalet Amos, as they say. And this, as I say, was a model that was picked up, excuse me, long ago in Europe, and worked pretty well for the Zionists up to Hitler. I mean, he killed everybody, so then, you know, it became moot. But it stayed in Israel and Palestine for many years afterwards. That works maybe in Israel. It doesn't work in America, like I say. This is a anti-totalizing culture country. This is a culture of bourgeois individualism. And so I'm willing to vote, and I'm willing to, you know, support my candidate, but I have a life, thank you very much. And my life doesn't involve, you know, the same thing all over again. It doesn't have to. You understand? And it's very foreign. Ben-Gurion couldn't understand that kind of Zionism. That's not where he came from, and he looked upon it with a certain contempt. To Ben-Gurion, Zionism was a cause for which 6,500 boys and girls gave up their lives in the War of Independence. It's not a hobby. It is a cause that he arrived in Palestine to work like a dog and lived a hard life and worked in the fields ever since he was young. It's not a charity bazaar in a synagogue on a Sunday afternoon the way it'll be in Baltimore, Chicago, or Toronto, or Omaha, or places like that. And then there's the pure politics side of this. Ben-Gurion was a jealous guy. He was jealous of charismatic Zionist leaders who can challenge his preeminence, particularly when the most charismatic Zionist leaders in America belonged to the ZOA, which was the opposite of the Mapai. He hated Abba Hillel Silver. And as soon as Israel became a state, he dumped him. Right? And he dumped him because he's jealous of him. It's politics. You understand? Abba Hillel Silver never really held an office after May 14th, 1948. It's pretty remarkable. And, he was angry about it, but there's nothing he could do. Then there's Ben-Gurion's petulance. He just had a personality. He liked to be a naughty boy. That's who he was in personality. And so in 1949 and 51, Ben-Gurion will constantly reiterate, in speeches that all American Jews must move to Israel or they're bad Jews. He publicly appeals to the American Jewish youth to defy their parents' bourgeois culture, come to Israel, and live a life of struggle in a frontier kibbutz, redeeming the land, the Negev, fight the border fights against Arab infiltrators, and thereby endow their dull, useless bourgeois lives with the existential meaning that comes only from expending oneself in a great cause, immolating one's life on the altar of a grand ideal. You can hear that, right? That's where he came from. That's not where most Jews in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1950 are at. In 1950, that's not what they want to live. This is totally unsuccessful. The post-war years are exactly the years when young American Jews, for the first time, are beginning to experience the American ideal of a life of total freedom combined with the highest standard of living on earth. The post-war period is that time when what I just described became an option for the vast masses of American Jewry. The universities, for example, are opening up for the first time ever. So is industry and other sectors traditionally off limits to Jews. What is the signature movie of the period 1945 to 1950? Gentleman's Agreement, right? Now, as anti-Semitism and exclusiveness is on the way out, the Jews are, quote-unquote, getting into the country clubs. You see? Now, you know, you can look at that as a positive thing, you can look at it as a negative thing. But you understand that a girl is thinking of getting a big house, moving to the suburbs and all that. They're not thinking, I'm going to a kibbutz and shoot the Arabs in the middle of the night. You understand? And so there's a disconnect between the way Ben Gurion is seeing things and where most American Jews are. They want the country clubs, they don't want the Ma'abara, whatever Ben Gurion's rhetoric is. Listen, it's not like he made a frum appeal, you know? No, it's not like he said like this, listen, it's a mitzvah, God wants you to do something. It wasn't like that. So then what kind of an appeal is it? You know, what kind of an appeal is it? Is it a nationalist appeal? Is it a cultural appeal? He's not talking to Jews that are starving in Yemen. You see? The American Jews are thinking Bess Meyerson. Ben Gurion, why do they want to go to Dov Yosef? Right? Bess Meyerson was the American girl who became Miss America in 1945. That's a signature moment of the acceptance of the Jew in mainstream American culture. Right? Mainstream American culture. This was the only picture I found on the internet I could show you. You know, anyway. But as a matter of culture, it is what it is. You know, this represents the fact, oh, now there's a future for Jews, and a golden future for Jews in American life. You know, the parents had to work at the sweatshops and all that, but it's after the war. And now the American economy is opening up, and all the opportunities are opening up. American Jewish parents resent this appeal of Ben Gurion's for obvious reasons. They don't consider themselves decadent, right? United States government officials, the Truman administration, don't like this either, but they're hesitant to criticize Israel openly during those years. The whole Ben Gurion approach does sound like he expects the American Jews to be Jews first and Americans second. And that's a tricky issue, even in the best of circumstances. It's a very dumb thing to articulate publicly. How do you think a guy like this feels when he reads in the paper all these Ben Gurion speeches? Let's go to the next one, okay? You know, that's all they need. Now, Ben Gurion does not care for the sensibilities of the American Jews. He ridicules them for feeling American. He thinks they're afraid to say that their first loyalty is to Israel, and that means he doesn't understand the psychology of the American Jews. This plays into the hands of the Council of Judaism types, like Elmer Berger, Rabbi Berger, the Reform rabbi, because he says, see, it's treason. It's traitors to be part of Israel. Look what they want you to do. Fortunately, he's quite marginal during that period. But more significantly, it plays into the hands of the American Jewish elites, like the gentlemen of the American Jewish Committee. These are the guys, remember Jacob Schiff back 100 years ago, and Louis Strauss. These are the rich German Jews, so to speak, who've made it on Wall Street and places like that, and reached the highest levels of the government and business and society. And they're very uncomfortable with Zionism at the level of the kind of thing that Ben Gurion is talking about. And this simply so they get, see, I told you it's a bad idea. He basically wants everybody to get up and move to Israel. Do you want to do that? He wants you, if you stay over here, to be like communists, a fifth column for Israel. Is that what you want to do? This is not what the American Jews wanted to be. Theoretically, Ben Gurion doesn't care about these guys. Practically, however, as Israel's economic situation becomes increasingly desperate in 1950 and 51, Ben Gurion realizes that American Jewry has been falling off in interest, and they've been falling off in dollars. ever since the end of the War of Independence, while Israel's financial needs have been climbing steadily thanks to its policy of unlimited aliyah. Ben-Gurion comes to realize, because that's called money, Ben-Gurion comes to realize that tactically he needs to mend the fences. And so in Israel, they're looking for schemes. I told you one last week where they came up with the money from Germany. To their shock, they got 800 million. Eliezer Kaplan, the finance minister, dreams up the Israel bonds. But the Israel bonds will not work without the establishment Jewish leaders selling the idea to the Jewish masses. Right? He's going to become the head of the poster boy for Israel bonds. Morgenthau is a guy. In other words, he was the Secretary of Treasury. He was very assimilated, all the rest of it. If you get people like him to say that this is something that American Jews should do, then you get the Israel bonds. But if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to cut out the rhetoric that you should be our fifth column, as it were, and that your primary loyalty is to Israel, and that all the American Jewish youth should disobey the parents, and so on and so forth. The next guy, Blaustein, is the head of the American Jewish Committee. Jacob Blaustein was a Baltimorean. I'm sure many of us know. In fact, not this year, but some other years, we got some funding from the Blaustein Fund. He left behind all these kind of funds for Jewish culture. He's Russian. He's not German Jewish. His father came here from Russia, and they sold, I think, oil or something like that out of cans. But eventually, he owned the oil company Esso or one of these things, and they sold out later on to one of the big boys. And so he was an oil man. You know what that means. And he's a rare case of a Jewish oil man. And as I mentioned the other day, he was the only oil guy that supported Truman in the election of '48. So he bet on the right horse. You understand? And he's not a German Jew. I say that for a reason. He has a Jewish heart. He did, no question about it. But on the other hand, he's a rich, established American Jewish guy also. He doesn't like all this Ben-Gurion rhetoric and what's going on over here, and so he wants to help. And he becomes the head of the American Jewish Committee, which has big contacts in the State Department and all the other, and the White House and all these other kind of power places in America. And Blaustein says to Ben-Gurion, you want us to help you? Fine, stop shooting your mouth off. Clarify, you can't be petulant, you can't act stupid. Clarify the fact that American Jews owe no political loyalty whatsoever to the State of Israel. This has got to be made very clear. If a Jew wants, as a matter of charity or something like that, to give money to Israel, fine. You can give money to cancer, you can give money to Albert Schweitzer, you can give whatever you want, you can give also money to Israel. But it's got to be on that basis. Once that is clear, the American Jew can display whatever sympathy and support there is. But there has to be clarity on the political aspect, and you have to acknowledge that we are Americans first and get over it. Ben-Gurion had no choice. He caved in. And so there's a famous meeting where Blaustein came to Israel, and they have this meeting at the King David Hotel, as you see over here, and each one delivers his remarks. And basically, he wrote a speech that Ben-Gurion had to give. He said, you better give this and mean it, or else we're not going to help you. You understand? And what we're doing is not unreasonable, he says. You're the ones that's crazy. And the result is that they basically, Ben-Gurion said, okay, I'll keep my mouth shut. And as a result, they said, okay, then we'll help you with the Israel bonds. And so in the next piece, I'll show a small segment of this. It doesn't work tonight? Okay, well, you saw it before. Ben-Gurion will come here for the first time in 1951. He'll say Truman and Atchison and all these other things. Gets a ticker tape parade in New York. Notice the establishment gets in behind him. And they say, we'll all do all the things you want. He goes and makes a speech in the Massachusetts state legislature. He visits the TVA. He does all over America. And wherever he goes, you get the associated guys behind you. You see? But it's quid pro quo. Right? But you have to say over and over again, Israel is just its own separate country. We have no expectation from the American Jews. The American Jews are Americans first, last, and always. They have no political loyalty with Israel whatsoever. But as a matter of charity, as I said before, or solidarity, or, as a good cause, because it is a good cause, listen, what is the main idea of the Israel bonds? The Ma'abara. We need food and shelter. This was true. And clothing and jobs. And health, education, welfare for masses of people coming in there. Nothing wrong with that. And if you do it on that basis, it's in there. And the result is, bottom line is, $75 million a year. So in the 1950s, that's what the Israel bonds will pull in, which was money in those days. Yeah, it's money. But the price is that Zionism loses its revolutionary quality, its particular elan, which ever since Herzl had been its particularly attractive quality to those looking to challenge the Jewish establishment. After all, what was Zionism from the time it started? They bucked the Jewish establishment, the Reformed Jews in Germany, the Reformed Jews in America, the wealthy Jews like Rothschild and Baron Hirsch and these other guys who always said, no, no, you guys shouldn't do anything. We're the ones that are leaders of the Jewish people, and Shah still and all the rest of it. And we favor assimilation, and we should be patriotic French Jews and German Jews. The Zionists are the ones that went against them. It was precisely these counter-cultural and even counter-bourgeois qualities that had attracted to Zionism its most creative personalities, even though personally as a religious Jew I might not agree with the ideas, but these ideas and policies had force and, more importantly, created facts, a string of facts. They did, get the Balfour Declaration, they set up the kibbutzim, and they did things. The attractiveness of Zionism, in other words, had been its radical critique, to use Baltimore language, of the associateds of Jewish life, which did nothing to stem assimilation, which spread defeatism and accommodationism, to the acid of modernity, which ceaselessly eroded Jewish essence. Most often, the source of this decadent attitude of the establishment lay, as it does today, in the advanced decadent quality of the Jewish lifestyles of the elites themselves, riddled with an intermarriage and characterized by an unbelievable ignorance of Judaism and Jewish culture. I mean, real Jewish culture, not just familiarity with Fiddler on the Roof and the vapidities of Tikkun Olam. We know the Jewish elites, it's sad, the Jewish elites around the world, including this country, know nothing about Judaism. And they're the ones with the checkbook. It was precisely the attack or the critique of these groups that had given Zionism its elan. In his call to the Jewish youth to disobey their parents, to forsake dental school and move to the Negev, Ben-Gurion was being true to the revolutionary aspect of Zionism, but he couldn't maintain the stance because he needed the bucks from the parents. Now, after Ben-Gurion's unavoidable caving in to the American Jewish committee types, Zionism in America in these years is co-opted by the establishment. It becomes safely ensconced in the federations and loses its counter-establishment qualities. To put it in simple English, let me ask the question: who is the leader of Zionism after Abba Hill Silver in America? Can you name anybody? No. No, they didn't. You get it? It's a million committees. As a treasury, as guys who are in charge of this little group, and now it's no personality, it's no leader. What about cultural Zionism? This has never been revolutionary, and except in its descent from fundamentalism, which stance was not revolutionary in America in accordance with the desires of the parents in this era. Cultural Zionism becomes the culture pervade in the schools of the conservative Reformed Judaism. He becomes the God. Even in many schools belonging to Orthodox Judaism, to be perfectly honest, in that period, Ivrit be'Ivrit is more important than Gemara. Finishing a Masechta, Siyum HaShas, that's another cultural universe. Again, instead of having a revolutionary or countercultural elan, which is the only thing that can ever attract the idealistic section of the youth, cultural Zionism will be federationed and establishmented. It will become Israel-centered plus American liberal. Its signature feature will become the Hebrew school kids who cannot wait to be free of the school. The treifa bar mitzvah, which is all bar and no mitzvah, with which we're so familiar. The result will be, it's sad. Not long ago, I was in Philadelphia doing a scouting trip. They have this museum, what's called the Museum of the American Jews. I went up there with a friend of mine. They have a whole section on the bar mitzvah and the bas mitzvah. They're celebrating the dumb side of it. I couldn't believe it. You understand? No, it's clueless. It's vapid. The result will be, as we know, standing today in 2013, a generation of American youth from Zionism is just a word. Part of the establishment world of their parents and their grandparents' generation. Intellectual Zionism will be dead for the youngsters. Passionately argued and eloquently debated questions of Zionist policy, of the future of the Jewish people, of practical grappling with the ever-present challenges of sociological as well as the intellectual assimilation will be off the radar screen for the generation described in Goodbye Columbus and the Barry Levinson movies, which despite their claims for being artistic and socially critical, simply chronicle and reflect the radically personal interests of the post-war me generations of the American Jewish youth. A non-intellectual Zionism will not passionately interest anybody unless he or she are making a living at it. Ben-Gurion preaches a revolutionary demonic Zionism, meaning, with to challenge the status quo, based on the Bible. Here's one of his famous Bible classes that he has once or twice a week in his house for years and years and years. He makes a big deal about Sefer HaSfarim. But he is challenged in these years by this guy, Rabbi Dolgan. I wish I wasn't able to get it in time for tonight. Those of you who maybe subscribe to commentary and all, you can get it. Right, Simon Dolgan was the rabbi in Bet Jacob in L.A. He basically founded the shul more or less. He was there for 30, 35 years. They made Aliyah. So here's a guy from Skokie. Okay, let's get this straight. A guy from Skokie, he moves to L.A. in the 30s when it's a midbar. And he takes over a shul, which is basically like a conservative shul almost. It takes him 20 years to get a mechitza. I just want to tell you, this is American mid-century. You should understand. Okay? 20 years, it's a very modern shul and all the rest. He made it Orthodox, modern Orthodox, and he's a passionate Zionist. He's a big Mizrahi. He made the Hillel Day School over there. He did a lot of things. Okay? So he's a very big Zionist. Now comes the state of Israel being founded, and Ben Gurion's making all the speeches. But everybody has to make Aliyah and all the rest of it. He's a big Mizrachist. So he's an intelligent guy, obviously. And so he has a whole correspondence with Ben Gurion, which is eventually published in the Commentary magazine in 1952, 53, and was also published in a book that I used to have, but I lent out like so many, and I'll never see again. But some of you may know what I'm talking about. Years ago, they had a book, Who's a Jew? And it was letters that Ben Gurion sent out when he was prime minister to like 100 leading Jewish scholars, most of them religious, and other types, and all the letters they got back. I think it got Litvin or something like that, published it, I can't remember. And in the back of it, they appended the correspondence with the Rabbi Dolgan. Dolgan is basically saying, and I repeat, he's a strong religious Zionist who made Aliyah eventually. And he's saying, you're telling the American Jews to come to Israel, all the rest of it. Why? Why should they come to Israel? And then Ben Gurion said, there's a Jewish culture. Why should somebody want to be Jewish? This is the land of the Bible. If it's the land of the Bible, what about Shabbos? You know what I'm saying? And you see that Ben Gurion trying to answer it, but at the end he just says, listen, we just think differently, or something like that. And it's almost a signature moment of the inability, to let's put it this way, to succeed with a message of revolutionary Zionism in Chutz La'aretz in America. And so, I conclude by saying, does Zionism survive success? Externally, yes. Internally, no. The two iconic representations of what I'm talking about, on the political Zionist front, we'll see the absence of an AIPAC rising in the years 49 to 52. That is something that does engage the passions of American Jews. That won't happen for another 20 years. On the cultural Zionist front, during these years, the absence of birthright, which had it been started in 1950, would probably have impacted positively on a half century of American Jewish youth. We know this. I don't know if I told you the story, but not last trip, but 2-3 trips ago to Israel, we're coming back. I just want to know where things are holding. We're coming back from Israel, my wife and I and the whole group, from the shul, and there's a bunch of birthright kids coming back. And they're from Stony Brook, is that what it's called? Yeah, Stony Brook. Nice kids, obviously nice kids. And Karen's talking to one of these guys, and she's saying, what impact has because where'd you go in Israel? Oh, we saw everything. Where'd you go? We went to the best bars in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. What about the Kotel? We did that too, And, but, okay, that's where they're holding. And she said, has this impacted, your Jewish identity or something like this? I wouldn't have even asked him that. And the guy, a very nice guy, he says, it definitely impacted. This is a life changer for me. I can honestly say, listen to this, I can honestly say, as a result of my birthright trip, for the first time, I'm going to seriously consider the possibility of dating Jews. Now, is that progress? Unfortunately, I'm just trying to show you where things are. It is progress, but it goes to show you where the football game is. You understand? It goes to show you where things are. The bottom line, Israel gains the establishment, but at the cost of vitally engaging the bulk of Jewish youth. As for the Merkaz Ruchani vision of Achad Ha'am, Israel it will not happen in the secular sector, where Philip Roth and Fiddler on the Roof will be the premier cultural phenomenon of American Jewry. not Moshe Smolenski or Aleph Beis Yoshua, if anybody even knows who they are. Ironically, this was not what anybody planned, certainly in the Zionist movement. The Merkaz Ruchani idea that Israel is a spiritual center will happen, but it won't happen in the Ben Gurion world. It'll happen in this world. You understand? Because from Judaism, Israel will, especially in the last 20 years, I would say, literally become the center. I mean, I don't have to tell you, these are people who have huge influence in American Jewry. Not only this, it's exactly what Achama was talking about, that there'll be a powerful center which will radiate out